In this video, I'm going to be sharing 5 great writing tips that I rarely see anybody talk about. Now, these are tips that have come from my experience of writing my books and of coaching other writers through the process of developing their stories. And while there are no such thing as a hack that will instantly make you a best-selling author, these 5 tips I'm about to share are designed to be extremely low effort but high leverage when it comes to improving your stories. Tip number 1 is to change the font when you're editing. So when you're editing a book, your goal is objectivity. You want to try to remove the fact that you wrote this manuscript and see it with fresh eyes. Now, from my experience, the easiest way to do this is simply to just change the font when you go back in and edit your book. When you do this, it kind of fools your brain into thinking that someone else wrote this story. And because you no longer attach yourself to the manuscript, you're able to be more objective and to see your story with clearer eyes. So for me right now, as I edit my next book, Kingdom of Dragons, I am going to be changing the font several times throughout the editing process as a way to kind of allow me to see the story more clearly. Tip number 2 is to read your story out loud. So this is another editing related thing that you can do here. When you read a story out loud, you will notice mistakes that you just can't see when you're reading it. It's very easy, particularly when you're editing a book that you may have worked on for quite a while, for your eyes to just start skimming over the manuscript and for you to kind of go into this blurred state of non-concentration. And in that state, it's very difficult to actually see these little sentence level errors in your manuscript. So what I like to do towards the end of my editing process, when I am trying to refine each sentence and make each sentence as good as it can possibly be, I like to read my manuscript out loud from start to finish. And yes, this takes a heck of a long time, but I've never found it to not be worthwhile. Something about reading it out loud just activates like a different, more critical part of your brain. You realize the areas where you're maybe stumbling over the sentences, and that can give you a hint as to what to change. Particularly if you want your book to become an audiobook as well, you really should be aware of how your story sounds when it's read out loud. Now, if you are exhausted by the prospect of having to read out loud your entire 200,000 word fantasy epic, then what you can do instead is use Word's text-to-speech feature to basically get Word to read your story aloud to you. And there's a lot of other editing programs that have this as well.
You can use Word's text-to-speech feature to get Word to read your story out loud.
In some ways, getting the program to actually read your story out loud is more beneficial than you reading it yourself, because when a computer is reading it, it's not going to be generous when it comes to interpreting how a sentence should be pronounced. It's going to pronounce it, the objectively right way, and it's not going to allow you to escape any criticism that comes from that. The third tip is to note your word counts for each chapter as you write. Now, this is something that I found extremely useful when I was editing my book yesterday. Basically what I do as I write my story, I'm using the headers feature in Word to basically create a table of contents in real time that I can flick between easily in my manuscript. And in my header, I actually don't put the chapter titles while I'm writing a story. Instead, I put chapter number, I put a brief description of what happens in that chapter, just to remind myself, and then I also put the word count in there. And the reason why I think it's useful to put the word counts into your chapters is you can see what the pacing of your story is like. If you notice that you go from having a 1,000 word chapter, 1,000 word chapter, to then a 5,000 word chapter, that is a very big difference in the pacing. And that's might be what you want, but most of the times you probably want your chapter lengths to be roughly sort of consistent in your book. So when you note down the word counts of each chapter, it just allows you to see at a glance, what is the kind of pacing and flow of my stories like? And a kind of extra hint with this as well, generally speaking, shorter chapters will create faster pacing and longer chapters will create the illusion that your book is longer and slower. So there's no one right way to do this, but that is just something to bear in mind when it comes to the reader's experience of your book. Number 4 is to keep a graveyard. So it's really difficult sometimes to cut stuff out of your book, even though that's sometimes exactly what you need to do. So what I do as a way to kind of trick myself into being liberal when it comes to cutting stuff out of my novel is I actually keep a separate document called my boneyard or my graveyard, where I just copy and paste everything that I'm cutting out of my novel. Now this way I feel like I'm in no danger of losing anything, and I don't feel like I've lost the progress of writing that stuff down, but I have yet to reclaim something from that graveyard and pull it back into my novel. But it's just good to have these little psychological tricks like this that will encourage you to make decisions that are in the best interest of your story and not hold you back from trimming the fat. And then lastly, tip number 5 is to stop while you still have inspiration. So I'm stealing this one from Hemingway. Basically, he talks about how you want to end your day's writing with the knowledge of what happens next. So you don't want to just use up all your inspiration in one day and then have to come back the next day and then fire up those creative cylinders again. Ideally, you want to get into the flow of writing, and then once you have a really good idea of what's happening next, you stop after a reasonable increment. I sometimes even take this to the next level and I stop halfway through a word so that the next day when I come back to writing, I can type and finish off that word straight away, and it instantly creates momentum, instantly gets over the blank page syndrome, and allows you to just progress with your writing with a really good sense of flow. So those are my 5 tips. If you're looking for some more storytelling lessons, you might like my free short ebook called 5 Lessons That Transformed My Storytelling. You can download it for free using the link in the description down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.